Before recording these midweek moments, there are several things I feel that I must do to prepare. Obviously, there's looking at the scripture and the world around us and trying to make some connection between the two, and then putting it in coherent form. Then there's setting up the camera here at church. For the first couple of months, I went various places in the sanctuary, which was then off limits to everyone. And recently, I've pretty much planted myself in front of the Jesus window from the Accord Church in our entry. But there's another thing I find myself doing, trying to pick out just the right shirt to wear. Whether Methodist tie-dye or bell tower logo or something else, I feel it ought to be both pandemic comfortable and nothing that clashes with the Jesus window. Today, as I pondered my choices, I realized how very fortunate I have been in life. I had shirt choices, lots of them, too many, to be honest. I have always had more than enough clothes available to me, a home, and more than enough food to eat. Materially, my cup really has overflowed. I realize that many people in this community, state, nation, and world are nowhere near as fortunate as I. As I read this week's lectionary scriptures from both the Hebrew Bible and the Gospel of Matthew, it's clear that both are dealing in some way with people on the edge, one step away from disaster. In both Exodus and Matthew, there's what can be described as divine intervention to bring those on the edge up to a point of adequate provision. And I think both are important to challenge ourselves to consider just what enough is and just what people, all people, us and others, ought to receive for their labor. And when I say that these things challenge us, I'm not kidding. Just think for a minute about the fierce discussion that erupts when the subject is minimum wage, welfare or entitlement reform, fair labor standards, or the like. What people deserve and what we ought to ensure everyone has are timeless hot topics. How about a closer look? Exodus bops right ahead from the first Passover and the parting of the Red Sea to the wandering in the wilderness in chapter 16, and maybe those words wandering and wilderness will serve as triggers to remind you that this was not a quick or a happy experience. Human nature being what it is, the complaints to Moses and Aaron started almost immediately. Oh, how we wish that the Lord had just put us to death while we were still in the land of Egypt. There we could sit by the pots, cooking meat, and eat our fill of bread. Instead, you've brought us out into this desert to starve this whole assembly to death. In response, the Lord provides bread from heaven, aka manna, and quails in the evening. 6 days a week, every week, they got just enough. On the sixth day, they got enough for the Sabbath as well. But I find it very interesting that in the verses after the lectionary cuts off, the Bible notes this. The Israelites did as Moses said, some collecting more, some less. But when they measured it out by the omer, the ones who had collected more had nothing left over, and the ones who had collected less had no shortage. Everyone collected just as much as they could eat. Everyone's needs were supplied. Gathering more did not make some people rich and powerful, and coming up short did not make others go hungry. God's distribution system looks kind of odd, if you ask me. On to Matthew chapter 20, where Jesus, in telling one of his kingdom of heaven parables, describes a landowner who's up against harvest in the vineyard and needs day laborers pronto. He went to the local agri-temp agency at the crack of dawn and hired some, we are told, for the usual daily wage. At 9 a.m., noon, and again at 5, he returned for more day workers, telling some of those he hired later that he would pay them whatever is right. You probably remember the way this ends. At the end of the day, he pays each and every laborer exactly the same usual daily wage, whether they'd been there an hour or 12. The 11th hour hires are presumably quite gratified by the day's wage. The 12-hour workers, not so much. True, the landowner gave them what they'd agreed on in the morning, a day's wage, and they'd put in a day's work. It's just no fair that the bums who were last hired and worked 1 hour got the same. And the landowner's response to the day-long workers grumbling? Are you resentful because I'm generous? I think that the honest answer to that is, yeah, sure, we got exactly what we agreed on and worked for. It's just that those other good-for-nothings, got exactly what we worked for without all of our work. What about that is even remotely fair? As with the daily manna, everyone gets what they need. Not everything everyone wants. Not everything they earn. Everything they need. And it sure looks to me like Jesus is saying that it is in the divine nature to give generously to all in need who are willing to receive, even when human nature might say, no, they haven't worked for that quite the way I worked for that. As Presbyterian pastor D. Mark Davis notes on this parable, whether speaking of a first-century field hand, a 21st century peasant in El Salvador, or a single mother working a minimum wage job with no benefits, the parable of Matthew 20 still arouses indignation among those whose needs are already met. Appealing to the economics of fairness, we find reasons why the poor are poor, why our own level of comfort is justified, and why we ought to be passionate that they only get what they deserve. The reign of God calls us to a new way of viewing the value of work by keeping the value of the worker central, even that worker who has only been working since 5 o'clock. Thank you, Pastor Mark. What a comfort to know that God takes your needs to heart, even when the world around seems unfriendly. And what a challenge to know that God takes other people's needs to heart, too. May God help us to see ourselves and our place in this world with the eyes of God's heart. God be with you till we meet again.